Hello, welcome to Hazelnuts 101. This is the first event in our 2022 Hazelnut Week series of events. My name is Jason Fischbach. I am the Emerging Crops Outreach Specialist for the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. The purpose of our Hazelnuts 101 presentation is to introduce this exciting new crop to beginning and aspiring hazelnut producers. We cover a lot of ground in this session to provide you with a basic understanding of where things are at. It's a new crop, so there are a lot of unknowns still, a lot of risks for someone that's going to jump into a new crop, but you can't get started without some basic information. So that's what this presentation is all about. It's super helpful as you start to think about your hazelnut adventure in terms of what kind of a grower do you want to be? Because that's going to largely determine the kind of plant material that you plant, the kind of resources you put into it, what you grow between the rows, and really how you measure success of your planting. So I'd like to review sort of four main options, if you will, that we see people that are interested in hazelnuts kind of sorting themselves out into. So the first is just growing hazelnuts as a hobby. And the whole purpose is it's a fun project. We see a lot of retirees do this or folks that are just sort of farming for fun. And the whole point would be to grow hazelnuts for wildlife or for eating, because the Midwest grown hazelnuts, regardless of what varieties you take, taste great. So it's definitely a good hobby for that reason alone. Others are planting hazelnuts for what I call the common good. They're trying to be a part of the solution of climate change by fixing carbon in the hazelnut plants. They're also interested in water quality because when you plant a perennial crop like hazelnuts, the soil doesn't move, and when the soil doesn't move, you tend to have much less water pollution. Planting for biodiversity, it's really pretty incredible when you plant these hazelnuts, just what shows up in your orchard or on your land, not only other animals and birds, but the insect populations, walking sticks, moths, and all kinds of other critters that really bring your fields to life. Another reason is, getting into more of a sort of profit-driven or a profit model is that you use hazelnuts as a complementary crop to enhance the overall profitability of the farm. A great example of this is some recent interest among dairy producers that are adding hazelnut rows within their hay fields, and they're alley cropping. So they have a row of hazelnuts every 30 feet or so, and then they're still able to get their hay or their corn silage crop off. And then when the hazelnuts are mature, now they've got another crop out in that field. But maybe hazelnuts at a larger scale, it's just a standalone crop, 10, 20, 30, 40,000 acres of hazelnuts. And the whole intent is to make money growing and selling hazelnuts. So it's important to think about what kind of grower you want to be as you go through this presentation or listen to this presentation. So here's just a basic hazelnut orchard in the upper Midwest. They're grown as shrubs in fairly close rows. We tend to see a 15 to 18 foot row spacing. And then in between the rows, when the plants are young, you might do some alley cropping, but generally we just see folks mowing between the rows. So real simple. This is an orchard that is pretty well maintained in terms of making it look nice and neat. This is more typical of the hobby orchards that I see. Grand intentions when they plant, but then life gets in the way. Grandkids or vacations, or they just don't want to work that hard. And so you start to see weeds growing in the rows, what one person might call weeds, others call wildlife habitat. So nothing wrong with an orchard like this. It's just the priority isn't necessarily maximizing hazelnut production. The idea is just to provide some perennial and diverse vegetation out there for everything else to use. The other thing you're going to notice in these hobby orchards, especially the earlier ones, is how different all the plants are. And we'll talk more about that, but that's because these are seedlings. In other words, every plant is grown from a seed. But again, a hobby orchard that tends to get a little overgrown. Then at a smaller commercial scale, when you're just thinking about growing hazelnuts, either a large hobby or small commercial where you're trying to harvest and sell, this is what we call a 12-18 orchard. This was sort of the original design that was recommended for hazelnut seedlings, where you've got alternating row spacing of 12 feet and 18 feet. And you'll see in the plants that are 12 feet apart at maturity, and this is a planting near Barneveld, Wisconsin, you can barely walk between those rows because the plants have gotten so big. We generally see more of a 15-foot row spacing now than the 12-18 model, but this is what a small commercial orchard, I think this is about 4 acres or 5 acres, would look like. Now, at a large commercial where the goal is to turn that field or use that field to make money, you've got to do something between the rows in the early years because you're going to plant 15 feet apart, which is quite a bit of space. Or if you're doing wider alley cropping, you might have 30 feet. And you're not going to start producing hazelnuts till maybe the 3rd year after planting, but you're really not coming into full production if all goes well till year 5. So that's a great opportunity to make some money between the rows, and that really helps your bottom line and the economics of the system if you're able to do something. So in this field, this is Spring Green, the Savannah Institute's home farm. They're growing potatoes and other vegetables between the hazelnut rows while they wait for the hazelnuts. This is the first year of planting. And that, of course, is the one weed that they missed, so we pulled it out for them. All right, those of you that have come into hazelnuts or learned about hazelnuts through reading about them or online or maybe read books, you're probably thinking about permaculture or what we in the business call multifunctional, multi-revenued, diversified perennial polyculture with animals, right? It's sort of the holy grail of perennial polyculture or even agriculture, if you will, where you've got just this incredible diversity within a field. In this particular example, you've got canopy trees, medium trees, shrubs, brambles. You've got animals grazing through there. You've got vines. You've got herbaceous crops, right? It's sort of how great would it be if you could just plant all this stuff and then just harvest as you needed or as when you needed to make money. Sounds like a great idea. It is a great idea. In practice, it can be quite a challenge to implement just because you've got so much going on and the labor needs really get to be pretty incredible. However, it's definitely an option with hazelnuts. Hazelnuts do well in these kinds of systems. Having a shrub mixed with a tree can work great. Now, hazelnuts are not particularly shade tolerant. You will see a decline in production if it gets shaded out, especially American hazelnut. But in terms of part of this multifunctional agroforestry type system, it's definitely something to consider. Okay, let's talk about markets, right? For any new crop, that should be your number one question, particularly if you're trying to make money, is I'm going to plant in 2023, let's say, and I'm not going to have stuff to sell till 2026, 2027. What are my markets? What are the projections for those markets? Where am I going to sell this crop once I start growing it? So we've got some answers for you. 5 years ago, maybe we would be guessing, but now I think there's a fairly straightforward path for you to do this, to market your hazelnuts. But as a smaller producer, which we all will be starting out, you really have to think about maximizing your revenue. And that typically means selling direct to your customer so that you can retain that full retail value. Selling to a distributor or even wholesaling to retailers, you tend to give up a fair amount of that value, and it can be harder to make your margins in that scenario. So starting out, you really want to think about, how am I going to sell direct to my customers? And the easiest folks to sell to would be your family and your friends, because you know them and you can probably sweet talk them into trying and buying them. And the good news is, once people try fresh Midwest grown hazelnuts, they love them. Roast them a little bit and you've got them hooked for life. Add a little flavoring, maybe a little salt, and watch out. You'll sell out every year. Option 2 is other direct-to-customer options would be farmers markets, online, CSA, farm stand, pick your own, right? All these that fruit and vegetable growers have a well-worn path to figure these out. So you can definitely add hazelnuts to the mix. You can sell in-shell hazelnuts without a food processing license. You don't need a license. You don't need anybody's permission to sell hazelnuts in the shell. However, most customers really these days aren't accustomed to eating in-shell hazelnuts, and they, maybe over the holiday season. But great, if you can pull it off, go for it. Otherwise, the rules regarding the sale of kernels or the nut meats or the hazelnuts themselves vary from state to state. In Wisconsin, if you want to sell one kernel, you have to get a food processing plant license from the Department of Ag, Trade, and Consumer Protection, what we call DATCAP. That requires having a food processing facility that meets food code. So you need a license and you need a facility, which is why we launched the American Hazelnut Company in 2014, which I'll talk about here in a second. In other states, say Wisconsin or Minnesota, and I believe still in Iowa, there are cottage food laws that allow you to sell direct to customers at a small scale without a food processing plant license. It doesn't mean you're off the hook for food safety concerns, right? If you did a bad job processing, you didn't wash your hands, it came in contact with manure, whatever, and your customers get sick, you're still liable. You're still going to get in trouble. And so you definitely want to be thinking about food safety, even though you may not need a license to sell kernels in those other states. But again, these are great options direct to customers. The third would be once you get to a little larger scale, or even if you want to work with your neighborhood grocery store, is selling via wholesale accounts, either the co-op grocery stores, specialty food stores, gift shops. They typically like unique, locally grown, produced food products. You do want to think about good, high quality packaging, start to think about your branding, because who knows, you might think you're going to start out with one little co-op grocery store, and all of a sudden your product is in such demand because you did a good job with branding and marketing that you're asked to get it into 20 stores, and now you're off to the races, right? So these are options, but it just involves another layer of thinking about packaging and branding. All right, so for those of you that want to just grow hazelnuts and you don't want to deal with the marketing, then the American Hazelnut Company is for you. This was formed by growers for growers, right? It's a grower-owned processing and marketing company. They buy in-shell nuts from growers, and then they turn them into kernels, and then the kernels they turn into other products. So like their hazelnut snackers line that you've seen here, which are flavored hazelnuts. Or they will press the hazelnut kernels to get the oil and then sell the defatted meal as a gluten-free flour. And they are currently buying hazelnuts. For them to expand, they need more growers, they need more hazelnuts. So in this sense, there is no limit on the market right now. Anything you can grow in the Midwest, they will buy. Will that change in the future? Probably. But as of now, have at it. Okay, someday hazelnuts in the Midwest will join the hazelnut world, which is a global commodity. They are traded and sold and exported and moved all across the world. Turkey is the world's largest producer still, followed by the European Union, or the other countries in the European Union, including Italy and Spain. We're also seeing new production in Chile and Australia. And anywhere you've got a sort of Mediterranean climate and European hazelnuts can grow, we're starting to see that kind of production because the global demand for hazelnuts has continued to increase. The prices stayed high because demand is increasing and supply has been slow to catch up. So will that change? Who knows? But to give you some example of the enthusiasm right now, Oregon is projected to get to about 80,000 acres, which is almost a doubling over, I believe, is like 6 or 7 years ago. So just a huge increase in production. But to give you some perspective, that's 80,000 acres in Oregon. There are 1.3 million acres of almonds grown in California, right? So the prognosticators see no end in sight to the increase in the hazelnut market, and especially as considering that American consumers really do not eat hazelnuts because they've never really been exposed to them except as a flavoring in coffee or Nutella. But once they've eaten fresh roasted hazelnuts, it won't be a problem to sell them. And so the future's bright, even as hazelnuts as a commodity. But again, you're not going to play in this space until you've got large enough production to feed big companies like Mars or General Mills or other larger food manufacturers. Give you some sense, again, who knows what the future brings, but some of the estimates by those that work in this space, whose job is to try to project out what demand would be, they are seeing almost a doubling from 2018 to 2028 in terms of the amount of product needed to meet demand, the amount of hazelnuts needed. So this is why folks are excited. But again, if you're starting out small, you don't need to worry about this. You just need to worry how to sell hazelnuts to your friends, family, neighbors, local grocery store, farmers markets, right? You need to sell direct because you're not going to be selling a couple 100 pounds to General Mills. Okay, so what should I plant? I get this question more than any other when it comes to hazelnuts. What kind of hazelnuts should I plant? All right, so there's basically 4 options. We'll go through each of these real quickly, and then we'll take a little deeper dive. First are European hazelnut cultivars. There has been a hazelnut industry in the US, in Oregon, almost exclusively limited to the Willamette Valley in Oregon for decades. And they've had an active breeding program and have released lots of great varieties, plus all the varieties that are grown in Europe. These are all a European hazelnut or Corlus avellana. And I put the word no next to it because they are just not dependably winter hardy in the upper Midwest. These were developed for zone 7, zone 8. We're a zone 3, zone 4, maybe a little 5A in the Wisconsin, Minnesota, and into Iowa. So they're just not. We have growers that are trying them, and they tend to grow for a few years. Then they're always getting winter injury. So they're just not dependable that way. The other main concern is a fungal disease called Eastern filbert blight. It's a disease that is native to the upper Midwest. It co-evolved with hazelnuts, our wild varieties, the American hazelnut. And our American hazelnut has resistance, but European hazelnuts have not co-evolved with Eastern filbert blight. And when exposed, they will die. It's lethal. They are lethally susceptible. Eastern filbert blight got into Oregon, almost wiped them out. All of the new cultivars have had some form of resistance bred into them, primarily from the gassaway gene, single gene resistance. That has broken down when exposed to the full range of EFB that exists in the upper Midwest or Eastern US. So we expect those to not survive. And even some of the newer varieties with quantitative resistance or more durable resistance may also not survive or Eastern filbert blight over time. So if you're trying to do this commercially, if you're just dabbling, putting in a couple, 10, 20 plants, have at it. What do you have to lose? But at scale, you don't want to plant these European varieties without more testing. And we'll talk about this in a minute. All right, so American hazelnut seedlings, those are what grows wild, Corlus americana. The nice thing is that the seedlings are cheap and abundant. The problem is that generally American hazelnut plants produce nuts that are really small with thick shells. And so there's not a lot of bang for the buck. In other words, you spend a lot of time and money harvesting, and at the end of the day, you end up with just a little bit of kernel. It makes the economics hard, and they're highly variable too, so your production isn't so good. If you're planting as a hobby, if you're planting for wildlife, it's a great option. But again, for planting as a hobby for nuts, you might as well plant larger nuts or improved varieties. So I put a maybe by this one. Hybrid hazelnut seedlings, yes, but as we'll explain with some caveats. I think the perception was when this all started 20, 30 years ago is that plant a bunch of hazelnut seedlings from the hybrids and all is well. Well, it turns out that's highly variable material. So out of 100 plants, you might have 10 that are good, 10 that are awful, and 80 that are somewhere in between. And what we've seen on average is that the average yields of these seedling plantings have not been high enough to support commercial production, which is why the industry really hasn't grown. We have lots and lots of little plantings, but nobody's really been successful enough to feel like they can expand using these seedlings. But they also have another role as a pollinizer, as border rows. We'll talk about that here later. So yes, but hybrid hazelnut cultivars, that's what we're after. So this is improved varieties of hybrid hazelnuts that are proven to work in our climate, under our disease pressures and on our soils. So those are the 4 main categories of plants that are available. So let's take a little deeper dive. Here's a picture of a mature hazelnut orchard in Oregon. It looks amazing. When you walk in there, you're just amazed at the plants, the nut production, the size of the nuts, and at the right time of the year, you can wear a hard hat as the nuts fall out of the tree to the orchard floor, which is why you see it's a flat orchard floor. There's nothing growing. And the reason is because the nuts fall out of the tree, they sweep them into rows, and then they vacuum up those rows. That's how hazelnuts are harvested in Oregon. But like I said, these cultivars don't work for us. And here's just a picture to tease you. Again, all these are great plants, but they don't work in the upper Midwest. So moving on. There is potential, perhaps, coming out of the Rutgers breeding program for European hazelnuts. They have been selecting disease-resistant varieties in New Jersey on the Atlantic seaboard. It's warmer than it is here. The winters are not as harsh, but they should have durable disease resistance. However, the breeders there, Tom Molnar and Rutgers University, are not recommending them except for zones 6, 7, and higher. So maybe try them in our most protected areas, right next to the Great Lakes, perhaps further south into southern Iowa or into Illinois. But I would not do this until somebody else goes first, right? So we have established some test plantings in 2021, and we'll see how they perform. And stay tuned. Okay, American hazelnut seedlings, just to give you some background where these come from. If you go up in northern Wisconsin or northern Minnesota, anywhere where there's sand on public lands, national forest, county forest lands, you're going to find hazelnuts everywhere, particularly where there's been recent disturbance like a fire or logging. They love full sun along power line corridors, edges of the road, any right of way that they generally keep the trees out of. You'll see nothing but hazelnut shrubs. So the DNR will collect seed, or they'll pay others to collect seed, and then they'll take the seed, grow them into plants, and sell you the plants, which is great. That's just a cheap way to do it. But the problem is you have no idea when you get that plant what it's going to do. And in general, American hazelnuts tend to produce, like I said, those small with thick-shelled nuts. But you can see how cheap they are. So you can buy the DNR, 100 plants for less than $1 a plant. So it's really tempting. And so for wildlife plantings, it works great. Hobbies, nothing wrong with mixing some of these in because some of them are pretty interesting. But generally, again, as a commercial crop, not ready. The nuts are too small. Okay, so hybrids, what are they? They are a cross between American hazelnut and European hazelnut, Corylus avellana by Americana. And the idea was to combine, or is to combine, the winter hardiness and EFB resistance from Americana with the larger nuts and thinner shells and higher productivity from the European hazelnuts. The offspring of those crosses are generally what we call the hybrid hazelnuts, which is different than, say, hybrid corn, which is produced through inbreeding. This is just interspecific crosses to try to get the traits from both species into one. The plant material is available on our website, the UMHDI website. There are 9 suppliers currently listed that sell these seedlings, and essentially they all follow the same model. They save seed from their best plants, grow out the plants, and then sell them to you. But because they're a seedling, because they grow from a seed, the nurseries don't have any idea what that plant's going to produce, and nor do you. So that's the gamble, right? You're going to plant these and you don't know how they're going to perform in terms of nut production for 4 or 5 years. You can get them in the spring as Barrett dormant, and the advantage there is that they're really vigorous, nice big root systems, and you stick them in the spring and they grow like crazy. The challenge with spring planting is sometimes the dormancy of the plants, like they come out of dormancy before the field is ready, or you get the spring rains, especially if you're on heavier soils, clay or loam soils, and the timing might not work out. And now you're either planting way too late or way too early, or just is a mess when you plant. So that's why another option is to plant containerized potted plants. They tend to be a bit more expensive because they include a pot and soil, and they're grown in a greenhouse usually. This is a nursery up in Bayfield, Hauser Superior View Farm Nursery. The advantage is you typically have a better planting window in the fall. You can plant pretty much any time from the 1st of September with some protection of the plants or hardening them off, all the way into October. And generally, you're going to find a dry window in that time. But again, these hybrid seedlings, buyer beware, because you don't necessarily know what you're getting when you buy these plants because they are seedlings. The nurseries are doing a great job producing high quality plant material. It's just the genetics that are highly variable. So expect variable production. As a hobby, great. As pollinizer rows, great. As border plants, great. But I'm not sure you'd do 40 acres not knowing how they're gonna perform for you. Like I said, the seedlings can be highly productive. Here's a picture of one in Spooner, just loaded with high quality nuts, right? Unfortunately, not every plant you get as a seedling looks like that. Sometimes you'll see growers or nurseries making claims about how the plants are going to perform, but they don't know. There's no way they can know because of the pollen, unless you take a controlled cross, say between parent A or parent B, and you grow out a bunch of progeny and test them at multiple locations. Then you can know generally how the family will do. But until you do that, nobody should be making any claims as to performance. Here's a photo of the hybrid hazelnuts at maturity, the seedlings being harvested, and you'll note they can take quite a beating. That's one advantage of these American hazelnut in the parentage is highly flexible stems. You go along and you shake off the clusters. But you'll note in that video, every plant's different. And the other issue is that they're all ripening at different times. So that big tall plant, which probably has more European in the parentage, holds on to the nuts longer into the fall. It takes longer for them to dry down and be mature. So you drive over it and they don't come off the plant. But then the next plant has been ripe for 3 weeks and most of those nuts are on the ground already. So that's been the challenge, is not only are they highly variable in terms of quality and productivity, but the maturity is so variable. So you're either picking by hand or you have to make multiple passes through the orchard, and that just all adds cost, right? So again, that's why these seedlings can be a challenge. But if you're just looking for nuts on a smaller scale, or if you're using the nuts, the plantings for a diverse pollen cloud or for border rows, they work great. I should say something about pollination. 2 hazelnuts of the same genotype. So if you took one hazelnut plant and you made multiple copies, they will not pollinate each other. You need 2 different varieties and they have to be compatible in their S alleles. And you don't necessarily know until you test that. So one way around that is to plant a bunch of seedlings, and you're going to have diversity in the S alleles. You're going to have diversity of when the pollen is shed in the spring. And so it really helps your overall pollination. So the model that we're talking about is you plant pollinizer rows as a pollen source, and you're going to get some nuts out of it. And then you have your cultivars in your main production blocks that are your main income source from hazelnuts. So we this is the second year, 2022, of what we call our UMHDI starter planting program. And what we're trying to do is be more intentional with the seedlings that growers are planting and that the nurseries are growing out. In plant breeding, you've got a couple of different approaches to how you improve the overall production of your plants or the quality. One option is you plant a real diverse population. You look for individual plants that are really high producers, and then you make clones, you make copies of that. So best example, maybe for those of you that aren't in the breeding business, would be Honeycrisp apple. The Honeycrisp apple, there are, I don't know, maybe 1 million trees or more. They all descend or are all copies of one plant in Chanhassen, Minnesota, where that one apple tree was found. And then they made millions of copies of that one tree. Okay, so those are clonal cultivars. The other approach is a seed-based approach, where you're basically taking your best plants, you cross them together, you grow out the progeny, and you save seed from the best plants and do it all over again. So then you save the seed, plant out those offspring, make crosses of the best plants, save the seed, grow it out. Problem with hazelnuts is it takes forever, because it takes at least 5 to 10 years to evaluate whether a plant is actually any good. And then you save the seed and you got to go through another 10-year cycle, right? So it just takes a long, long time. Well, we've got some groups that have been doing this over time. So Forest Ag, New Forest Farm has had a seedling population that they've been selecting from over the years. Badger Set Research Corporation, one of our pioneers here in the Midwest in doing this, has a population. Badger Set's no longer in business, but the Experimental Farm Network has taken over some of their breeding populations. And then our program, the UMHDI program, has been doing something even more robust in this approach to breeding, where we took the best plants from all these plantings across the Midwest, made copies of those individual best plants, planted those at multiple locations, evaluated them in replicate, and then have been saving seed from the best of those plants. It's really expensive to do. It's really hard for private breeders to evaluate that in that way. And so we've been saving seed from in what we call our first gen half sibs. Superior View Farm has been growing those out for us, and those are available to growers. So again, these seedlings from improved populations are still going to be highly variable, but at least you're, helping take one step forward in this effort to develop improved germplasm through the seedling approach. These plants, at least for 2022, are sold out, but we'll offer the program again in 2023 to get access to this plant material. All right, hazelnut clones or cultivars. Again, this is plants made through vegetative propagation rather than seed or sexual propagation. And you can see there in the picture, I'm holding a rooted layer of a plant we call Shep Rosie. This came from Mark Shepard's breeding program, a plant he calls Rosie. It looks very European, pretty good yields, but really nice quality nuts. So we've been making copies of those for planting at other places or other farms to evaluate. Hazelnut clones, when they start out in the breeding program, they'll start with a breeding number. So an example would be OSU 541.147. That means when it's still at the sort of breeding stage or breeding number, it's being tested, but hasn't yet been released as a named cultivar to growers. This OSU, though selection, the Oregon State University selection, has recently been released as the Beast. That's the cultivar name. And you can currently buy the Beast. We've been testing the Beast here in the upper Midwest. It has not survived the winters very well in our northern sites, but in Madison, it's done really well, though it has yet to produce much for a nut crop. So we're still waiting in the 6th year. So the main question now as we enter this phase where breeders are offering clones or cultivars is you've got to ask them, how extensively has it been tested? Ideally, it would have been grown on your property for 10 years, and then you know exactly how it's going to perform on your land. Not really practical, right? We can only do this testing in so many places. So you're looking for, has it been tested? If somebody just takes their best plant and makes 1 million copies and they haven't tested it anywhere else, that's a pretty big risk. And you'd want to know that before you'd buy those plants because they could turn out to be total duds on your property. So we've been testing multiple sites, and you just hope that someone's tested these plants as close to you as possible. But anyway, ask those questions of the breeders before you buy. So where and when can you get these hybrid cultivars? Folks have been waiting for decades for this kind of material. The UMHDI selections that I'll mention here in a second are not yet available, but those that get involved in our grower networks that are on our mailing list will be the first to find out. So we encourage you, go to our website, get on the mailing list, and we send out periodic updates. The Hazelnut Consortium, which is a collaboration of Rutgers University of Nebraska, and Oregon State University, have 2 plants that they have made available. The Beast that I talked about in Grand Traverse. Grand Traverse is not from their breeding program, it's from the Cecil Ferris selection, but they have done a good job, the consortium, in evaluating it and working with breeders to get it out to growers. Again, in the upper Midwest, Wisconsin, Minnesota, there are real questions about the winter hardiness of these because they do have Turkish and European, and some European in the parentage, and so they're just not as winter hardy as American hazelnuts. But they're available. I think they're worth testing, but I wouldn't do it at a plant a big scale if you're in Minnesota or Wisconsin at this point, based on the results we've seen. Grimo Nut Nursery in Ontario has some great selections. They are in our joint performance trials I'll talk about here. The one that is rising to the top, head and shoulders above all the rest, is Northern Blaze. It produces nuts across where we've tested it, from far northern Wisconsin down to southern Wisconsin, but it's been doing way better in the southern part of the state than the northern part of the state. So I'm not recommending it yet for the northern part of the state, but I do recommend it for the southern part of the state. These are available in limited quantity. And the plants get pretty large. The plants get a little bit floppy because of the yields, but the nuts are a really nice size and big kernels and taste great. So it's definitely a plant worth trying. And then Z's Nutty Ridge out in New York also has some selections that are available in limited numbers. So you just need to go to these websites and see where they're at. Most likely you're going to have to get on a waiting list, and it might be a couple of years till you get the actual plants, which is becoming more and more common in the apple industry. There's usually a waiting time for new releases. Here's a picture of our UMHDI first generation selections. These again were plants that were evaluated and replicated at multiple locations, and based on the yield, disease resistance, winter hardiness, kernel quality, kernel shape, they rose to the top as the best of the best. And these are the ones that we're actively propagating to get out to growers. Our first step is to, again, evaluate these at even more sites so that we've got even better data. So we're just trying to to reduce the risk of early adopter growers to jump into this. So at least they've got some comparison plantings to look at. So the blue dots are joint performance trials where we've got the material from all of the different breeding programs around the country that we think could work in the upper Midwest. And then the red dots are where we have just our UMHDI selections. Our hope here is to continue to add over the years. The joint performance trials are now in their 6th year, so we're starting to see active production for the oldest plants. So these are going to be a really valuable resource for growers that are kicking the tires of this potential new crop. Give you some sense of where they're located: Bayfield, Verona in Wisconsin, Staples, St. Paul, Minnesota, and Marion and Fenton in Iowa. And they go from a 4A to a 5A. Even the Bayfield site's 5A because it's right next to Lake Superior. Last year is our first data year. First year we had production at age 5, and only from the Ontario selections and data from the 2 plants from the consortium, Grand Traverse and the Beast. And you'll note the yields at the Verona site, which is down by Madison, way higher than the St. Paul and Staples, and the Bayfield site isn't shown here. Almost no production at those 3 sites because of winter injury on these Ontario selections. But in Verona near Madison, Northern Blaze, these are commercial yields. These are, for age 5, this is pretty good per plant. So based on that, and what we've seen across the other sites, we think this is something for you to pay attention to, Northern Blaze. We haven't harvested yet here in 2022, but we're seeing similar yields, at least visually, on the plants at these locations. So it's exciting. And you can see the quality there in the photos of the size of these nuts. Northern Blaze is not the largest of the Ontario selections, but it's way bigger than American hazelnuts produce. Now, next up, because we established these joint performance trials with our UMHDI selections a couple years later. So the Ontario stuff was put in, or Grimo stuff was put in 2017, and we planted 2019, 2020. So our UMHDI selections are just starting to come into production. But here's one of them at the Madison, or the Madison location, and then one at the, I believe it's Rosemont on the right side. It's mislabeled, sorry, or on the left side. Really high production early in their life. So this is year 3 and year 4. You can see just how much nut production there is. We have been selecting for plants that produce a lot of nuts early in their life, what we call precocious. And that helps keep the plant size a little bit more manageable, but also it helps the bottom line because you've got something to sell earlier in its life cycle. So that's what you should expect from these UMHDI selections. Okay, so putting it all together, we are now establishing what we call these Go First farms, a couple in Wisconsin so far, and keep adding as we go. And the idea is we're continuing to do breeding. So some of these plants are seedlings that we're trying to select for the next best thing. And some of these are the cultivars that we've planted, say in this row in the front of the picture. And what we're recommending is that you start with the seedlings because they're widely available. You put those in as border rows, or every 6th row is a pollinizer row, and just think that they're not necessarily for commercial nut production. Instead, they're for you to get experience growing hazelnuts. And from those populations, you also will be able to select the best plants. It's going to take time, but you're almost like your own backyard hazelnut breeder. And you're going to get nuts from these seedlings. It's just making money, it maybe isn't going to happen. But anyway, start with the seedlings. And then as the cultivars become available, fill in your rows. So now you might have 5 rows of cultivars and then a row of seedlings. And you're planting in single cultivar rows so that they all ripen at the same time. So if you're planting commercially, you'll be able to mechanically harvest that whole row, one pass, one time, and you're done. So let's shift into establishment. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. This is the Hazelnuts 101 session. We're trying to cover a lot of ground, but we don't go very deep. So let's talk establishment. This is what we did at the Ashland Gophers farm in September of 2021. This is sort of the current recommendation of how to go about this. We started with existing vegetation, grassy alfalfa field, and we didn't spray out the rows, but you can spray out the rows to get rid of the weeds. We just ran the rototiller over it once. Then we ran a single shank ripper, and that's just a tool that gets down deep into the soil to break up compaction. You need decent horsepower to pull it. You want to get down at least 18 inches. And I really can't recommend this high enough because you may not have plowed your field, but if somebody plowed it with a moldboard plow 50 years ago, you probably still have a compaction layer under the surface, and that's going to greatly restrict the growth of your hazelnut plant. So you want to get rid of some of that compaction. And we just do the single shank right down where the plants are going to go, right down the middle of that row. And then we do a last rototilling to break up all the clods that come up from that deep shank ripping and get it ready. And then we hand plant, which you might say, a 10-acre planting by hand is going to take work, and it is. But if the soils are pretty loose, you can do it by hand, or if you're planting Barrett dormant and even containerized, you can have a mechanical transplanter too to speed it up a bit. But you want to do a really good job planting, because the hope is you only have to do this once every 30 years, right? And if you plant poorly, the plants are going to struggle. You're going to have more mortality, just a waste of money. We planted the tubelings, or sorry, the containerized plants that we got from Hauser's in this planting on September 16. And you can see they're still growing in green. We did lose some of the leaves from the transplant shock because they went right from the greenhouse to the field. The longer you can hold them outside before you plant, the better, to get them to harden off a bit. And you could probably wait till the end of September to plant as well. We do recommend you put a tube on them when planting in the fall to protect from rabbits, to protect that sensitive stem tissue coming out of the greenhouse. And really, it's a tool that you can use for weed control the next year. If you want to use Roundup or other herbicides, you can apply it, and the tube protects your hazelnuts, so you don't have to be quite so careful. The other thing is that ultimately or inevitably the weeds get out of control, and if you have to do a rescue mowing, the tubes show you where the hazelnuts are, so you don't mow them down. But beyond that, that's basically the recommendation. You'll note in this picture there's not mulch. We highly recommend mulch. Any mulch will do, whether it's grass clippings, sawdust, straw, hardwood, softwood, whatever you've got. Put 4 to 6 inches down around the plant. A donut, not a volcano, and that just helps moderate that soil moisture, because the year of planting and the year after planting, you've got to be able to provide moisture to the plants, or they're going to die, or they're going to struggle, and now you've lost a year. If it doesn't rain, you're going to have to water, but the mulch just gives you a lot more room for error. Here's the finished planting. We applied sawdust mulch by hand. At scale, this gets kind of be miserable to do it by hand, shoveling it out of a pickup truck. But you can get a chopper box with a side discharge and apply it mechanically. So anyway, get the mulch on. Management. So there's a couple issues here once you've established. First of all, weed control. Don't do this, right? It might sound like a good idea. Oh yeah, you just stick hazelnuts in the ground, and then they'll if they don't survive, fine. But you're trying to select the ones that are competitive with the weeds. That's great, but if you plant 100 and you get 2 that survive, what have you got? Besides, you did a great service for somebody, maybe, if that plant actually is any good and actually was able to outcompete the plants. But in the meantime, you've lost most of your plants and you've slowed them way down. So I don't care how you do it, but control the weeds. It's just going to help get established and promote good, vigorous early growth. So what we say is sort of sod culture, if you will. Keep everything weed free within the row, and what you do between the rows doesn't really matter during the establishment phase. Use sawdust mulch. If you want to use herbicides, great. If you want to do it organically, you likely need to use mechanical cultivation, and you also need to think a couple of years in advance to try to get the perennials out of that field, particularly the rhizomatous perennials like quackgrass and thistles. Because with organic, you don't have as many options to control those particularly bad weeds. So again, it's doable. Now, some folks say, well, let's just cover crop the whole field. Great. But in the establishment year and even the second year after, that cover crop can compete with your plants, with your hazelnuts. So generally, I recommend is the first couple of years, grow all kinds of great vegetation between the rows, but then within the row, keep it weed free. You should just see mulch and hazelnuts. That's the goal. And then once the plants are established, put whatever cover crop you want down. Put clovers, put white Dutch clover underneath the plants and around them, and then they'll do fine. But the main thing is we've just seen so many plants die because there wasn't good weed control. So you'd much rather have a hazelnut planting that's 30 years old than to have 1 year where you planted hazelnuts, but dang it, you weren't going to do any weed control and then you had nothing. Well, great, you planted hazelnuts and didn't do weed control, but you got nothing, right? Big deal. You want hazelnuts that are 30 years old someday. All right, so beyond weed control, you're going to have to deal with the wildlife, right? You just have to accept the fact that you're going to feed the critters to some extent. You don't want to feed them all your hazelnuts, but in Oregon, when you visit them, the growers, they'll tell you the 2 outside rows they lose to the critters. It's just the reality. So if you plant just a few hazelnuts, you're going to call me and complain that the critters stole all your hazelnuts, and it's true. It's just like if you plant 1 or 2 blueberry plants. If you don't do netting or something, you're going to lose them all to the birds. So our main pests of the nuts would be squirrels and chipmunks and blue jays. Blue jays can clear out an amazing number of hazelnuts. And so the way we stay ahead of them is plant a lot of hazelnuts, but also is don't go on vacation in the fall. Because seedling hazelnuts in particular start ripening in the end of August and will continue into early October, depending on the year. Every plant's going to be ripe at a different time. If you pick them too early, the plants, you're going to get terrible kernels. If you wait too late, the critters will probably get them. So you have to wait till the day they're ripe, then pick them. So you're out, you should be planning in the fall to be out there every other day picking hazelnuts. And over time, you'll learn your planting. You'll learn that this plant is always early and this plant's always late, and you just start to get a pattern of your harvesting. So if you stay on it, you're going to stay ahead of the critters. Again, you're going to lose some, but you just really can't go away all of August and early September and come back in the late September and think you're going to have any hazelnuts there. Now, deer, going to be an issue for sure. Some properties worse than others, just depends on the habitat and your deer herd population. They will browse on hazelnuts. They tend not to eat the nuts that I've ever seen, but they will browse on the buds. But it's not like dogwood where they're going to chew it to the ground. They seem to nibble it and move on, but they will slow the plants down. And so you really want to think about some sort of deer exclusion with fencing, either individual plants at a really small scale, but putting up a perimeter deer fence. Some of those 3D fences, again, because they're not preferred browse, you don't necessarily have to have 100% exclusion. You're just trying to reduce the browsing. And then in the early years, you can use deer repellent sprays like Plant Skid works pretty well. So you just need to do something to reduce the deer browse. All right, eventually you're going to have to deal with insect pests. We're in this sort of honeymoon phase because a lot of these pests build up over time, or they're moving from wild plantings. And so they haven't found your planting yet. And even if they have, they take a while to build up their populations where you start to notice damage. So there's 4 main insect pests. The nut weevil, which I'll talk about, is going to be our worst pest and is our worst pest. Stem borers that can kill individual stems. Big bud mite that gets into the plant and you start seeing these big swollen buds in the spring. Won't kill the plant, but it really reduces yields and growth. And then stink bugs, if you've ever seen like a black mark on the husk or on the surface of the shell or on the kernel itself, that's probably stink bug damage. So the weevil, this is a native insect that feeds on wild hazelnuts. So if you're near wild hazelnuts, you should expect to get these weevils eventually. They lay their eggs in a developing nut in the spring and early summer. And then the larva, the little worm, if you will, inside or grub inside the nut will feed on the kernel as it develops. And then that larva will exit just at the time when you're starting to pick the hazelnuts. So late August, early September, those larvae will drop to the ground and then overwinter in the ground. And then in the spring emerge as adults yet again to continue the cycle. So it takes a while because these pests don't move very far. So generally, if you have a problem, it's because it's been developing over time. And in some of our older plantings in Minnesota, Haley Shanovich, who did all this early work on hazelnut weevils, found damage as high as 25%. So 25% of all the nuts had weevil damage. That's a serious pest. So we're going to have to deal with this eventually, and we're starting to work on control recommendations. Ideally, we don't have to use chemical sprays to do this, but we're gonna have to do something. Okay, size management. Eventually, these plants, especially if you're on pretty fertile ground in the southern parts of the state, these plants are going to get tall. They could be, especially seedlings where haven't really been bred for size. They could be 15 feet tall. And if you're trying to hand pick something that big, you're going to hate it and you're not going to do it. And generally, the nuts are at the top of the plant where the sun is shining, right? So we're going to need to control the size of these plants one way or the other. We have more questions than answers at this point. We do know that every plant is going to grow a little bit differently, and so your pruning or your size management strategies are going to be different for each plant. Give you an example on the next slide. I'll give you an example. The way we're trying to work around this plant size is through breeding and trying to select for compact plants that produce a lot of nuts. That the ends of the branches, what we call terminal bearing, rather than buried inside the plant. That the plants do it early in their life, so that helps keep the plants small, and somewhat upright even when they've got a real high crop yield like this plant. This is, to me, is sort of like the ideal. You can hand pick this if you wanted to, and you can move a harvester through this plant and pick that way as well. So that's what we're trying to breed for. If the plants don't do this on their own, then we have to do some sort of pruning or size management. The other reason is, or the other thing we want is a fairly compact plant at the base. As the harvester moves down this row, the plants go through the machine, and there are catch plates that go underneath the plant. And so when you shake the top of the plant, the nuts drop down into the catch plates and move out the conveyors. If the plant is really wide, A, there's going to be damage, but B, the nuts, when they're shaken, are going to fall down into the plant and not into the machine. So we need a compact base in order to do the mechanical harvest. Again, we're trying to breed for that, but you might also have to do pruning to maintain that plant form. As an example, here are two of the UM-HDI selections. Cuddy 228 on the left is just naturally grows as that sort of ideal compact form. It doesn't sucker or spread very much, so it'll always be easy to harvest mechanically. State Bend 76, on the other hand, spreads like crazy. So we have almost have to treat that like a raspberry, where you have to mow and to control the width of your row. Let it fill in and then constrict the size of that row just by periodic mowing to knock those stems down. Okay, that's all we'll say on the size management. That's definitely a focus of our research going forward, and we'll have better recommendations here as growers get to the point where they have mature plants, which will be a number of years in the future. Okay, so harvest and processing. If I was giving this presentation 5 years ago, I'd say, I don't know what to tell you. You're on your own. You figure it out. There's no hazelnut industry in the US or in Wisconsin. There's no nut industry in Wisconsin. So it's not like there are existing processors that you could have taken or could take your hazelnuts to get processed. So 5 years ago, you were on your own. Today, thankfully, you're not. I feel like we've got this covered for you, that if you want to grow hazelnuts, there's a means for you to get them harvested efficiently and turned into saleable kernels efficiently, right? So let's just walk you through the process. You can hand harvest. I've been doing it for a lot of years. I feel like I'm relatively fast. I can do about 17 pounds of in-shell per hour. If you can do faster than that, more power to you. Most people are slower than that. You're picking clusters, so it's a lot of weight. They're pretty heavy, a lot of volume. And the nuts are all over what can be pretty tall or big plants, so it's just relatively slow. You've got to dry them in the husk. Our research plantings, we tend to put them in greenhouses to dry them down in the husk. We're hoping that we change that, but for now, that's generally what people do. So 17 pounds of in-shell per hour, if you're paying someone to do it, that's going to get pretty expensive. So that's why, on a hobby scale or really small scale, this works. Or I suppose if you could find a pick your own, but even pick your own folks are going to get 17 pounds an hour and start to think, is this worth it? So again, hand harvesting is doable, but commercially it's really not viable. So then we're looking at mechanical harvesting, and thankfully existing technologies work. It's not like we have to design a whole new technology. These straddle harvesters that go over the row and shake the plants vigorously to knock the clusters off work well. Our problem is not so much the harvesters. The problem is the plant material, which is all super variable. These seedlings that people have that have been growing are either too tall, too wide, or they're maturing at different times. And so it just makes things so inefficient. But I'll just show some of these videos. This is a rotary shaker harvester operating there on the right. This is an Oxbow olive harvester. All of them work on similar straddle type shaking mechanisms. And these can handle pretty big plants, but not that big. And then you've got an old blueberry picker that uses some sway action or slapper action bars to knock the plants. Again, the beauty of our hazelnuts is they can take a beating and they're just fine. Okay, so the reason we do straddle harvesting is because a couple of reasons. One is in our climate, if we let the nuts drop to the ground, A, smaller plantings are going to get destroyed by the wildlife, and B, in some years, and probably most years, it's going to rain. And now you're going to have this muddy mess and moldy kernels and just a wreck, right? Whereas in Oregon, they pretty much can rely on having dry conditions throughout their harvest window. Some years they get burned, but most years they're fine. We just can't rely on that. So we have to pull these nuts off the shrubs directly. The other thing is from a wildlife habitat, from a water quality, from the slopes that we have, we don't want bare orchard floors. We want something growing under those plants. We want something growing between the rows. And if we do straddle harvesting, that allows us to do that. Okay, so now you've got in-husk hazelnuts. That's what you've harvested. Now you've got to get them out of the husk. And you'll note in these seedling populations where everything's so different, just how variable the husks are from plant to plant. Okay, the importance of harvest timing. This can't be overstated. If you get out there and you want to beat the chipmunks and blue jays and you pick a week even too early, you'll see what happens is on the left side here, August 15, this is all the same plant, just harvested at different dates. As when August 15, the kernels look great when you harvest them, and you're like, yes, I beat the squirrels and chipmunks. But then those kernels start to dry, and they shrivel up because at August 15, they're mainly water. What happens in that last couple of weeks is it converts all that moisture it pulls the moisture out, and it's replaced by oil, protein, and other carbohydrates, and there's very little water left in those kernels, so that when they dry, they stay nice and plump and full. The other problem is if you pick too early and the nuts aren't ripe, it can be really hard to get those nuts off of the husk, what we call stick-ons. So you really just have to be on it and picking when they're ripe and try to get them before the chipmunks and blue jays. This is why mechanical harvesting seedling is also a problem. When you run that harvester over and you end up picking plants that aren't quite ripe, you end up with a lot of shriveled kernels. Most growers are drying these down. This is a model that's used worldwide. In Turkey, this is how hazelnuts are harvested. They're always dried before they're dehusked. So you can dry them in the sun. You can dry them in onion bags in a greenhouse. In this particular case, they're on a rack in a garage that's heated with a dehumidifier, and you just try to dry them out as fast as you can. And then once they're dry, you can run them through these huskers. Again, 5 years ago, you'd all be using a barrel husker, but now we've got 3 of these Hazelnuts in the upper Midwest. This is a Turkish dehusker where it's just vacuums up those piles, and then 5 minutes later, you've got in-shell nuts. We'd like to get to a point where we are dehusking right out of the field or even in the field as part of the harvest process, what we call green dehusking. Turns out this technology here, the Pendragon X12 that was developed for that purpose, does a really good job. There's, I think, 2 of these that have been built, and there's a little bit some outflow problems with it, but the technology is good that we're just trying to get the next iteration with Pendragon Fabrications, John Bashaw, to get it out to growers because it's working well. Now you've got a mix after you dehusk of the in-shell nuts and the husk material. So you just have to separate those two, and we just use air. This is an aspirator. This is a $500 setup, except for the Vibe feeder. That's about $1,000, but it's just a shop dust collection system. So it's pulling air up the tube. You drop the nuts in, all the light material, the husk material gets pulled through the cyclone into the waste bucket, and then in this bucket is nothing but in-shell nuts. So a DIY project that's easily doable. We end up with stick-ons. No matter how good you're harvesting and no matter how good your dehusker, you end up with some of these. Now, if it's just got a little husk still attached, it might mean it's a blank, nothing you can do about it. It might mean it just wasn't husked very well. And if it's just a little bit, that's okay. It'll flow through downstream machines, the cracker and whatnot. But if you've got doubles and you've got other big chunks of husk stuck to it. It's a huge problem, so you've got to get rid of that. And any old tilt bed table would work. Basically, that belt is moving, and anything that's flat or not round will get pulled off, and everything that's round, your in-shell nuts, will roll down. And so now you've separated your in-shell nuts from your stick-ons. Works great. This is a machine that you could have built. You can buy these types of things. They're used in other industries, or you can just go find an old treadmill, tip it up on its side, and use a treadmill. Anything at this stage you can do without a license. You're just think about food safety, but you don't need any fancy equipment to do this step. All right, so now you've got in-shell nuts. They all have different shapes and sizes. Most crackers rely on compression cracking, meaning it's going to squeeze the nut just enough to crack it, but not too much that it'll break the kernel. And so in order for that to work, you have to calibrate your cracker to the size nut that you are cracking. And you can see coming out of our seedling fields, you've got nuts as small as 9 or 10 millimeters all the way up to 16 millimeters or larger. So somehow you have to separate those into size classes. So there's a couple technologies available. There's a drum sizer, and then there are these roller sizers. The drum sizers tend to be a lot faster, but the concept is the same. You're just separating them into sizes. This is an example of one in Oregon. This is very common technology. So you dump them in one end, the tunnel is turning, and the nuts flow down that tunnel, and the holes get progressively smaller, larger as you go, so that your small nuts drop out here, your larger nuts here, and your largest nuts there. Great way to separate, really fast. We have put all this technology together into our processing accelerator facility up in Ashland, Wisconsin. It's available to anyone to use. There is a fee to the college that hosts us, but it's a great way, and we've made enough progress now that it's really cost effective and efficient and fast to get your nuts turned into saleable kernel. So we use the Burrell cracker from Spain. I'll show some video of that, but there are other crackers available. There's the universal nut cracker. It's been available forever. Works great. It doesn't crack the nuts the first time through, all of them. So you have to refeed back through the machine to get them all cracked. You do damage a fair amount of kernel on this machine, but it's fast and it works great. It's a bit pricey, a couple $1,000s. The drill cracker, which is run by a cordless or a corded drill, is about $500 at last check. Works almost identical to the way that the universal does. It's just cheaper and a little bit slower, and you have to provide your own power to it. The Dave built cracker, a handheld cracker, works fine too. Similar concept, but it's just super cheap and easy. But at any sort of scale, it's just too slow. This is some compression-based cracking. This is a unit that is used at the research facility in Oregon. The concept is the nuts flow down this channel, and these two cylinders that are turning up, if you will, to move the nuts down the channel, they get farther and farther apart, so that the small nuts drop out here and the large nuts drop out down here. Depending on how you set, there's an infinite number of sizes you could separate. But then as soon as they drop through those two rollers, they fall into these two rollers, which are now spinning against each other. And this is the cracking mechanism. So the gap here is just a tiny bit smaller than the gap here. So it's calibrated that they drop through here, but crack through here. Works well, but these channel or roller sizers tend to be small, or tend to be slower than, say, the Burrell cracker. So you'd either need more of these, you need longer channels, but there are big facilities in Oregon that use this technology. They just have lots and lots of rollers. Here's the Burrell cracker, which is nice because it will size the nuts at the same time as they crack. You just feed them in there. They go across a vibrating table and fall through the holes, and right below it is the cracking mechanism that cracks them. Really fast, really efficient, food grade. This is what we use. So coming out of the cracker is this mix of shell fragments and kernels. You've also got some split kernel. You've got some uncracked nuts, and now you're going to need to separate all this stuff out. And you need to get all of that shell out of there, because if your customer bites into a shell, breaks a tooth, you've got a problem. So the game is how fast and cost effective or cheap can you get this separated. So one technology that's used is just a curved slot sorter. It's a drum sorter with curved slots, and it's pretty slick. The shell fragments are curved, so they will fit through the curved slot, but the kernels are round, and they won't fit through the curved slot. So it does a really good job separating the shell fragment from the kernel. And here it is in action. You just feed it down through this big barrel. The barrel's spinning, and the shells and split kernels fall out through the curved slots, and then the whole kernel and the uncracked stuff falls through the round slots. Works great, really fast. But just like even the largest facilities in Oregon, there's always the hand cleaning step, because again, no machine is perfect. And so the human eye has to go through there and separate out or get out that last little bit of kernel. You can add color sorting technology and other things as you get larger in scale and can afford fancier equipment, but there's always going to be this final hand step like this bank robber here. Here's a line, when this is running, there might be 10 people standing here all day looking at those nuts going across the belt, trying to get out that last little bit of kernel. Okay, last couple of slides here. We have put together some enterprise budgeting tools for you to figure out, does this work for me? It goes step by step what's involved in each phase of your hazelnut adventure, your establishment phase, pre-production, early production, renovation, size management, full production, and then your harvesting data. So you can plug in all your numbers, like what's it going to cost you to run a rototiller down that row? What's it going to cost you to put the plants in the ground? What's it going to cost you to do your weed control? You plug in your own numbers, and it'll kick out an enterprise budget that'll show you what your income might look like. We've come up with our own estimates, and we've published this thing that says, can I make money growing hazelnuts? It's available on our midwesthazelnuts.org website. We encourage you to read it and then scoff at it and say, I can do it cheaper, or I can sell the nuts for more. And we say, great, that's why we developed this tool for you to punch in your own numbers and figure out if it works for you. So that's it. Hopefully you enjoyed and learned something from the presentation. If you have questions, there are all kinds of printed materials on our website, midwesthazelnuts.org. We also have a series of podcast episodes that you can listen to, and there are also some videos that you can watch. So read, listen, watch, however you prefer. You can learn more about hazelnuts and start to get involved in this emerging new crop. Thank you, and have a good day.